Hello and welcome to Carbon in a Colorado Reservoir. We're going to be talking about the journey of CO2 through this reservoir, the inputs, the uses, and then the outputs of carbon in this reservoir. Regarding the inputs, carbon primarily enters through atmospheric CO2 absorbed by aquatic plants or plants that drop their leaves and then that flows down the watershed into the lake. Additionally, many nutrients get washed down the watershed into the lake, and that affects the carbon intake and production at this lake. Like we talked about last week, the phosphorus and carbon, the relationship and how that affects, for example, algae blooms, which affects the carbon output, all of that. The primary producers here include submerged and aquatic plants, algae, grasses, surrounding trees and shrubs and stuff. Seasonal changes then affect that productivity, so that changes based on whether it's spring or winter or whatever, like the amount of production changes. And then the algae and the fast-growing plants fix most of the carbon due to their rapid growth and retain it. Fixed carbon is used mainly for growth in new leaves, stems, roots, reproductions, flowers, seeds, that sort of thing, and supports the local plant and animal population. From there, it is consumed two different ways. The herbivory pathway, which carbon moves into herbivores like aquatic insects, fish, and birds grazing on plants, or it goes the detrital pathway, which is dead plant matter falls as litter or detritus, feeding decomposers like bacteria and fungi. This reservoir, the detrital pathway is likely dominant. There are herbivores present, but I think because this is a more urbanized area, the amount of animals that are interacting with the lake is decreased. That means that there's much more of a detrital pathway that's dominant and smaller animals that are interacting with the lake as a result. Carbon leaves the ecosystem a couple different ways. The decomposers like bacteria break down the detritus, releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere through respiration, or they get eaten by larger animals, such as depicted here, the crawfish or the snails, anything that eats those smaller decomposing things. And again, that works its way up the food chain as those animals get eaten or as they breathe, it's released into the air again as CO2. Carbon is also stored temporarily in sediments as organic matter, or it sinks to the bottom and gets stuck there in the soil at the bottom of the lake and becomes a carbon sink in that way. Or animals that have eaten the animals that either are herbivores and feed on the plants themselves or the detritus themselves, then get eaten by larger land-dwelling, air-breathing predators such as the bear depicted. And then again, that gets released back into the atmosphere through breathing. The balance between storage and release determines whether the reservoir ecosystem acts as a carbon sink or a source, because basically the more carbon is able to be released from that, the more it releases into the air, versus if it doesn't have a lot of those pathways to be released back as CO2, it might sink down to the ground, as we talked about. Real world reflection Luke Reservoir, or this reservoir, I changed the name, acts as a modest carbon sink. Like I said, it's predominantly detrital in its pathway, and as such, a lot of that carbon is not taken on by bigger animals, bigger breath, bigger respiration, releasing bigger amounts of CO2. It either sinks to the bottom or is eaten or moves up a very small food chain, and therefore is not released as much into the atmosphere. Some things that would be useful changes, like making sure that we monitor and correct things like urban runoff or shoreline development to make sure that there are proper pathways to either collect or release the carbon as needed by the local ecosystem, and make sure that we maintain that balance. Also protecting wetland vegetation, limiting nutrient inputs, and restoring native plants can enhance carbon storage and prevent the release into the atmosphere. Thank you so much. This has been Carbon in the Colorado Reservoir.